Today we're exploring a fascinating reversible design, mobius. The wonderful mobius shape creates a flattering fold in the front while hugging the back smoothly, from small cowls to large shawls. In this first video in the mobius theme, we'll first briefly explore the features and transverse construction of mobius. Then we'll work through a mini project, step by step, including the cast-on, stitch pattern, my intuitive grafting technique, and the final decorative edging. I've designed the reversible basketweave stitch pattern based solely on knits and purls, so it's easy to knit, easy to learn to graft, and works for transverse mobius. For this section, I'm using circular needles, and I'll give tips on how to adjust for straight needles as we go along. You will also need a blunt yarn or tapestry needle for the grafting. I've used a very simple crochet stitch for the decorative edge. I'll give some tips for a knitted edge as well. You can use any yarn you like with a matching needle size. I'm using basic acrylic yarn, size 4, with 4.5mm needles and a slightly larger crochet hook. At the end, we'll examine how to size your mobius project for best results. So what is a mobius? A mobius strip is an elegant shape that is both simple and complex. This seeming contradiction applies to this three-dimensional shape with only one side and one edge, which you'll see is key to the design and construction. It's closely related to a loop or infinity loop with a twist. The transverse construction for a mobius strip is the easiest. A long rectangle is knit back and forth. Then a half twist is added before the ends are attached. Starting anywhere and following the strip all the way around, we'll pass the reverse side of where we started, covering all surfaces, and then getting back to the spot where we started, in one endless path. In the same way, the mobius has only one edge, which we'll use to create an eye-catching contrasting edge. Clearly, the key to awesome mobius projects is complete and reversible seamlessness. Not only is the shape of the mobius intriguing, the impact on reversibleness is also fascinating. Reversible stitch patterns need to be carefully structured to be truly seamless when used in a mobius. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in a video exploring reversible stitch pattern design. So let's knit! To attach the ends in a seamless way, it's easiest to use a provisional cast-on, so we can graft the ends together at the end. My favorite is Judy's magic cast-on using circular needles, which we'll go through together step by step. If you only have straight needles, you can use a different cast-on, such as a crochet provisional cast-on, making sure to leave a long enough tail to graft with, at least 30 centimeters or 12 inches. Cast on 12 stitches or any multiple of 4 for the mini project. Let me know in the comments if you have questions about this project if you use a different cast-on. Skip to this timestamp to continue with the stitch pattern. I've made some adjustments to the original Judy's Magic cast-on so it's easier to work for grafting reversible projects. I'll show each step at least twice. With a 30 centimeter or 12-inch long tail end towards you, hold the two needles in parallel, pointed left. I'm using 2 different needles so you can see the difference, and so it's a bit easier to knit the project, but it's not strictly necessary. The bigger needle is towards the back and will be used to hold the provisional stitches, and the needle I'll be knitting with is toward the front. The first stitch is a backwards loop over the back needle so it doesn't end up twisted. Point the needles away from you, then scoop the yarn with the back needle. Set up similar to the long tail cast-on with your thumb and finger between the yarns. We'll create pairs of stitches, with the front yarn creating the stitches on the back needle and the back yarn creating the corresponding stitches on the front needle. Turn the left index finger towards the front needle, loop the yarn over the front needle, always from front to back. Now we have a stitch on each needle. For the next pair, with the thumb, work the front yarn between the needles and loop the yarn up and over the back needle, again from front to back. With the index finger, loop the back yarn over the front needle from front to back as before. Let's do that one more time. Thumb towards the back, loop the yarn from front to back, index finger to the front, loop the yarn from front to back. Looking at the stitches on the needles, the loop on the yarn is oriented like a regular stitch, open to the left. Let's do that one more time. Thumb towards the back, loop the yarn from front to back, index finger to the front, loop the yarn from front to back. On the bottom side, you can see the yarn joining the 2 rows of stitches on the needles. Continue casting on pairs of stitches until you have 2 multiples of 4 plus 2. Plus 2 selvage stitches is 12 stitches on each needle, or any multiple of 4. For this stitch pattern, we need an extra half pattern at the end, so the Mobius will have a seamless stitch pattern at the graft. Besides Mobius and Infinity projects, I also use this cast on for toe-up socks because it creates a beautiful seamless toe in stockinette. Just for now, leave the last stitch on the front needle off. We'll add it in the first row. If you're not using a bigger needle to hold the provisional stitches, make sure there is a tail. We'll be taking the last row out before we graft, and we'll need a bit of extra yarn to make it easier. We'll be working the stitches on the front needle. Carefully turn the work, keeping the loops on the needles and the tail end secure. Pull the larger needle out so the stitches are in the middle of the cable to create some slack. Find the other end of the working needle and we're ready to go. This stitch pattern is an easy 3-row repeat. For this first row only, we'll create this selvage stitch with a yarn over. If you've used a different provisional cast on, slip the first stitch. The first row is repeat knit 2, purl 2, ending with knit 3. I'll mark this side and refer to it as side A. More on that in a minute. The second row continues the rib pattern. Slip the selvage purlwise with yarn in front. Work row 2 as repeat purl 2, knit 2, ending with purl 2, knit 1. In general, knit the knit-looking stitches and purl the purl-looking stitches. To make grafting easier, I'm using a simple slipped selvage, knitting the last stitch. We'll also work into the selvage for the contrasting edge. The third row is a straight knit row. Slip the selvage and knit across. This is the row that creates the reversible basket weave pattern. It also makes grafting easier. Continue this 3-row pattern for at least 30 centimeters or 12 inches for the 12 stitches and longer for wider swatches. We'll examine suitable project proportions later in the video. As with all 3-row repeat patterns, it's technically a 6-row repeat. For open-ended projects like scarves, this is often inconsequential. But for this project, to keep it clear and unambiguous, I'll label all the rows from 1 to 6. For reference, row 1, 3, and 5 are worked on side A, which I've marked, and rows 2, 4, and 6 are worked on side B. End after a row 1, making sure it's a row 1 worked on side A and not a row 4, which is worked the same, but on side B of the fabric. I like to delay cutting the yarn as long as possible in case I want to make changes. For the join to be seamless without a break in the pattern, we need to remove the first row of the cast on, as it's not needed anymore. Carefully tink back the row, making sure not to twist or lose any stitches as you work. If you're using a different provisional cast on, you can return the stitches back now as well. I'm using a smaller needle so it's easier to graft from, but again, it's not strictly necessary. We'll use this end of the yarn to graft with. It will be exactly the right length. The last stitch will disappear. We'll recreate it as part of the selvage. Now comes the critical step. Orient the fabric so the cast-on edge is at the bottom, with the initial yarn end to the right. So now we're looking at side B. Roll the working end of the fabric under and up to meet the cast-on. To create the Mobius, flip the left edge of the working end up and over, twisting the fabric. The working yarn should now be on the left. This creates a traditional female closure. To create a male closure, pull the right edge up and to the left. I've secured the edges together with a stitch marker now that they're lined up. We'll graft in the missing row together by running or sewing the yarn between the ends using a needle. If you're familiar with knit and purl grafting, you can use your preferred method to graft a 2-knit, 2-purl row into a knit row above. Skip to this timestamp for the next section if you like. If you've never grafted before, or you don't like mnemonic-based grafting methods either, I'll show you an intuitive method by reading your knitting to graft in any basic knit or purl rows, and then we'll graft the rows together. To make sure we start from the same place, I have a short explanation. Let me know in the comments if you find this helpful. In knitting, a stitch is defined as a knit stitch or a purl stitch by how it's connected to the stitch below. This is fundamental to knitting and grafting. A knit stitch is a loop of yarn that lies over the top of the stitch below, and a purl stitch lies under the top of the stitch below. So technically, the yarn that creates the notable purl bump is actually from the row below, and not part of the yarn making up the purl stitch itself. The grafting row will create a new row between the stitches below and the stitches above by sewing in the row. The stitch below was defined when it was worked. The stitch above defines the stitch above it, but it is actually not yet defined itself because the legs are not attached to anything. So we're dealing with two rows of knitting when we graft. The grafting row will define itself and also the stitch above as it's being created using 3 steps. I'll describe the steps first, and then we'll use this method for the mini project. Step number 1. Enter the stitch below to start the grafting stitch. To graft in a knit stitch, enter the stitch below purlwise so the yarn is over the top of the stitch below. To graft in a purl stitch, enter the stitch below knitwise so the yarn is under the top of the stitch below. Step number 2. Catch the legs of the stitch above. To define the stitch above as a knit stitch, the yarn goes behind the legs. To define the stitch above as a purl stitch, the yarn goes in front of the legs. Step number 3. Complete the grafting stitch by returning along the grafting yarn. For a knit stitch, return into the stitch from front to back over the top of the stitch below. For a purl stitch, return out of the stitch from back to front under the top of the stitch below. Using these 3 intuitive steps, we can create any combination of knits and purls for the grafting row and the row above the grafting row. 2 comments before we see how to put the theory into practice. For this project, all the stitches in the row above will be knit stitches for simplicity, so we'll use these 2 combinations. Also for this project, the 2 pieces of fabric that are being grafted are attached head to toe. That is, all the stitches are oriented in the same way, like these diagrams. This method also works for head-to-head grafting with some adjustments, for example, closing the top of mittens. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in a video with an example. So let's do it. I'll show each step at least twice. To avoid managing 2 needles, I'll pull the needle on the bottom edge to the middle. This is not strictly necessary, but I find it also makes the stitches easy to find. If you're not using circular needles, then a small gauge needle can work as well. We'll start directly with the self edge. You can see that we need to make a loop coming out of the stitch below and around the legs of the stitch above, like in the explanation. You can see that the yarn end is already partially through the stitch above, so we'll back it out first. This is only required for this self edge. Notice where the yarn end is coming from and retrace the yarn to undo the stitch. Now we can follow the steps. Step 1. Enter the selvage stitch below purlwise to create the knit-looking selvage. The tip of the needle is on top of the stitch. Step 2. Catch the legs of the selvage stitch above, which was where the yarn looped through before. The needle is behind the legs of the stitch. Step 3. Complete the grafting stitch by following the yarn back in. The needle follows the grafting yarn and goes into the stitch. You can see how the grafting stitch makes a seamless selvage. Now we'll graft the rest of the row in pattern in a similar way. You can see in the diagram that the last row we worked was a row 1 in this direction. The grafting row is a row 2, which is knitting into knit-looking stitches and purling into purl-looking stitches. We'll be grafting in this direction, so we'll read the chart also in this direction. So the stitches are as written and not reversed. The cast-on row will become a row 3, which for this stitch pattern are all knit stitches worked in this direction, again, which simplifies the process. The first stitch of the grafting row is a knit stitch. Step 1, enter the stitch below purlwise to start the knit stitch. The tip of the needle is on top of the stitch. Step 2, find the two legs of the stitch above will go behind the legs to define the knit stitch. The right leg is connected to the selvage stitch. Drop the right leg off the needle, and you can see the left leg hiding under the needle. You can see before you pull the yarn through that the stitch above the grafting row now looks like a knit stitch. I find it easiest for the yarn length to be under the needle so you don't mistake it for a stitch leg. Step 3. Complete the knit grafting stitch by returning along the grafting yarn back into the stitch below. You can see after you pull the yarn through that the grafting stitch also looks like a knit stitch. Let's do that again. The next stitch combo is the same. Step 1. Start the knit stitch by entering the stitch below purlwise, needle on top of the stitch. In step 3, we'll be going back along the yarn in the other direction over the stitch below. Step 2. Catch the right leg of the stitch above, which was the left leg of the previous stitch. It's tempting to go straight through the 2 loops on the needle. However, the top of the left loop is actually the leg of the next stitch. So drop the right loop off the needle. Now you can see the left leg and you can go behind it. Check that it looks like a knit stitch before pulling the yarn through. Step 3. Complete the knit grafting stitch, following the incoming yarn back in as we saw in step 1. The next grafting stitch is a purl to stay in pattern. Step 1. Start the purl stitch by entering the stitch below knitwise this time, needle under the top of the stitch. Step 2. Define the stitch above as a knit stitch, the same as before. Catch the right leg, let it drop, and catch the left leg. Check that it looks like a knit stitch. Step 3. Complete the purl grafting stitch by following the incoming yarn back out under the stitch below. Let's do that again. The next grafting stitch is another purl. Step 1. Start the purl stitch by entering the stitch below knitwise, needle under the top of the stitch. Define the stitch above as a knit stitch, catch the right leg, drop it off the needle, catch the left leg, check that it looks like a knit stitch. Step 3. Complete the purl grafting stitch by following the incoming yarn back out under the stitch below. Continue to graft each stitch in pattern, 2 knits and 2 purls, ending in 2 knits as a reverse row 2, and always defining the stitch above as a knit stitch. Make sure that the yarn is clear of the cable on the bottom and under the needle on the top. Because you're reading your knitting as you graft, you can notice a mistake right away and correct it easily. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in a video explaining grafting where the cast-on stitches are a combination of knits and purls. There's a helpful trick for purls. When you have created each stitch in the row, we'll create the other selvage stitch. Enter the stitch below purlwise, then find the 2 legs of the stitch above. For this selvage, one leg is not on the needle, but it's easy to find now that we know what to look for. Then complete the grafting stitch as before on top of the stitch. I like to pull the yarn to the correct gauge for each stitch as I make it. If the grafting stitches are not even, you can tighten them up a bit, starting on the right and carefully pulling each leg. When you're happy with how the row looks, you can carefully pull the needle out. If everything worked right, then you've made a seamless join. After you weave in the ends, you can add a contrasting edge to set off the elegant mobius design. For this mini project, I crocheted the edge, a simple repeat of a single crochet into the selvage, and then a chain stitch, which makes it look the same on both sides. For this larger project, I used beautiful variegated yarn that my daughter found, and that's the inspiration for this project. For this edge, I repeated a backwards single crochet and then a chain stitch. I'm very happy with the result. You can also pick up the selvage stitches with a double-ended knitting needle if you like. I suggest only going through the back loop of the selvage. So how long should a bigger project be before it's time to graft? That's what we'll talk about next. The key to sizing transverse Mobius projects is to consider the length and the width at the same time. For example, for a cowl, it needs to fit over the head, for example 50 centimeters or 20 inches around. Let's say I want to make the cowl 20 centimeters or 8 inches wide. If you make the length just 50 centimeters, it will be quite snug. A better measurement is incorporating the diagonal. So the length of the knitting should be 25 centimeters for the back, plus the diagonal for the front. So this much in total. You can always use stitch markers to connect the ends temporarily and try it before you commit to the grafting. I've named this stitch pattern Reversible Basket Weave because of the alternating knit and purl looking panels before and after the straight knit and purl looking rows. For a larger project, make sure to include a half pattern and the selvage stitches in your cast on count, so a multiple of 4. So the stitch pattern creates a seamless Mobius join. You can make the basket weave larger in scale if you like, for example by 3x3 knit and purl panels. You will need an extra half panel, so 3 stitches in this case, to create a seamless Mobius, so a multiple of 6 stitches plus 3 for the half pattern and 2 for the selvage stitches. If you're using a different stitch pattern for a Mobius project, I highly recommend that you make a small swatch that is long enough to twist so you can be sure that the stitch pattern will be seamless. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in a deep dive on how to design Mobiusable stitch patterns. Worst case, you can create an infinity scarf instead. The next video will be simpler and shorter. We'll explore a genuinely reversible version of the linen stitch before we continue the Mobius theme. So pick up your knitting and create something awesome. I'll do my best to respond to comments, and I'd love to hear about your favorite reversible knitting pattern. Also feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more awesome reversible knitting. For those of you still here, the last few years I've been working hard to find simple ways to feel better, what I call my daily well-being practices. This is not medical advice, I'm just sharing what works for me. Today's well-being practice is about avoiding regret in life and in knitting. I have found that looking back and saying, I should have done this or that, is not good for me. There is nothing I can do about the past, and it creates some cognitive dissonance anxiety because I really want to do something. I prefer to say, the next time I will do this or that. I can impact the future. I can learn from the past in order to apply it to the future so I can move forward. I've been very careful to think and say the next time in the last few years. I find it makes a big difference for myself and my family. This applies to knitting. I can always find ways to make a project better after it's finished. And I keep this in mind for the next one, so I keep improving. Have a great day.